In the sweltering heat of Babylon, in the early days of June 323 BCE, the most powerful man in the known world lay dying. Alexander the Great, the king who had conquered an empire stretching from Greece to India, was reduced to a fever-ravaged shell of his former glory. At just 32 years of age, this legendary warrior, who had never lost a battle, was about to lose the only fight that truly mattered, the fight for his own life. But death would not come quickly, nor would it come with dignity. What awaited Alexander was a horrifying descent into physical decay that would shock even the hardened generals who had witnessed countless battlefield atrocities. The circumstances surrounding Alexander's death have puzzled historians for over 2 millennia. Was it poison? Disease? The accumulated toll of years of relentless campaigning? The ancient sources offer conflicting accounts, but they all agree on one disturbing detail. The condition of Alexander's body after death was unlike anything witnessed before or since. For 6 full days, his corpse showed absolutely no signs of decomposition, leading many to believe he was not truly dead but merely in some form of suspended animation. Then when decay finally began, it came with a vengeance that transformed the once beautiful young king into a grotesque spectacle of putrefaction. This is not a tale of glory or conquest. This is the story of how even the greatest of men must face the ultimate equalizer, death, and how Alexander's final days and the subsequent treatment of his remains became a horror story that would haunt the ancient world. From the fever that ravaged his body, to the political machinations that delayed his burial, from the mysterious preservation of his corpse to its eventual grotesque decay, we will explore every disturbing detail of Alexander the Great's horrifying, rotting death. The final banquet. When the fever took hold, the beginning of the end came at a banquet. It was late May 323 BCE, and Alexander had returned to Babylon after years of exhausting military campaigns. The city, one of the ancient world's great metropolises, was to serve as the capital of his vast empire. Alexander had ambitious plans: another campaign to Arabia, the circumnavigation of Africa, the fusion of Greek and Persian cultures into a unified civilization. But on that fateful evening, as he reclined among his companions at a feast hosted by his friend Medius of Larissa, something went terribly wrong. Ancient sources describe the moment with ominous clarity. Plutarch, writing centuries later but drawing on contemporary accounts, tells us that Alexander drank heavily that night, as was his custom. The wine flowed freely, and the revelry continued deep into the night. Then, according to some accounts, Alexander suddenly cried out in pain, as if struck by a spear. He clutched his side and doubled over, the color draining from his face. Others report the onset was more gradual, a creeping discomfort that slowly intensified over the course of the evening. Regardless of the specifics, by the time Alexander left the banquet, he was already marked for death. The initial symptoms seemed manageable. Alexander experienced a fever and intense thirst, common enough afflictions in the scorching Mesopotamian summer. His physicians, the most skilled in the ancient world, attended to him with concern but not alarm. They had seen Alexander wounded in battle numerous times: an arrow through the lung in India, a sword slashed to the head in Pakistan, countless other injuries that would have killed lesser men. Surely, they thought, their invincible king would recover from what appeared to be a simple fever. They could not have been more wrong. Over the following days, Alexander's condition steadily worsened. The fever did not break. Instead, it climbed higher. His body temperature rose to dangerous levels, causing him to sweat profusely and lose vast amounts of fluid. The thirst became unbearable, insatiable. He drank constantly, but no amount of water could quench the burning inside him. His skin grew hot to the touch, flushed and dry despite the perspiration. The royal physicians tried every remedy in their considerable arsenal: cooling baths, herbal concoctions, bloodletting, prayers to the gods. Nothing worked. The king who had conquered the known world could not conquer whatever was consuming him from within. As the fever raged, Alexander's mental state began to deteriorate. Delirium set in, that terrifying twilight state between consciousness and unconsciousness, where reality and nightmare blur together. He began to speak of things that made no sense, calling out orders for military campaigns that existed only in his fevered imagination. He saw enemies where there were none, believed himself to be in places he had conquered years ago. His companions watched in horror as the brilliant strategic mind that had outmaneuvered every opponent from Athens to India crumbled into incoherence. The royal court descended into chaos. Rumors spread like wildfire through Babylon. The king was dying, the king was already dead, the king had been poisoned. Alexander's generals, the hard-bitten veterans who had followed him for over a decade of continuous warfare, found themselves paralyzed by uncertainty. Without Alexander, there was no clear line of succession. His half-brother Aridaeus was intellectually disabled, his son Alexander IV was not yet born, and his wife Roxana was pregnant, but could not rule in her own right. The vultures were already circling, preparing to tear apart the empire the moment their leader breathed his last. By the second week of June, Alexander could no longer speak clearly. His voice had become a hoarse whisper, his throat so parched and swollen that words came out as barely intelligible croaks. When his generals came to see him, he could only acknowledge their presence with the faintest movements, a slight turn of the head, a weak gesture of the hand. The man who had commanded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, who had given speeches that inspired men to follow him to the edge of the known world, was now reduced to silence. And still, the fever burned on. What was killing Alexander? This question has occupied scholars for centuries, and the answer remains frustratingly elusive. The ancient sources offer various theories, each as plausible as the next. Some claimed it was malaria, endemic to the marshy regions around Babylon. Others suggested typhoid fever, spread through contaminated water. Still others whispered of poison, a convenient explanation when a powerful ruler dies suddenly, though medical historians have largely dismissed this theory. More recent scholarship has proposed West Nile virus, a mosquito-borne illness that causes the exact symptoms Alexander experienced and can be fatal in severe cases. The Death Watch, 10 days of agony. As Alexander's condition continued to deteriorate, his inner circle began what can only be described as a death watch. The royal diary kept by Eumenes of Cardia, and one of our most reliable sources for Alexander's final days, provides a day-by-day account of the king's decline. These entries, preserved by later historians like Arrian, offer a window into the gradual, agonizing process of Alexander's death, a process that would take nearly 2 weeks from the onset of serious symptoms to his final breath. On the first day of his final illness, recorded as the 18th of the month Daisius in the Macedonian calendar, Alexander still had enough strength to perform his daily religious sacrifices and to bathe. He spent the day in an antechamber of the palace, speaking with his officers about a planned expedition. By evening, however, the fever had intensified. He was carried to a pavilion beside the swimming pool, where he attempted to find relief in the cooler air. But sleep would not come. The fever saw to that, keeping him in a state of exhausted wakefulness through the long, hot night. The following day brought no improvement. Alexander was bathed again, performed his sacrifices, maintaining his religious duties even as death approached, and then was carried across the river to the park. There, lying in the shade of ancient trees, he tried to distract himself by listening to his generals discuss military preparations. His mind, even in its fevered state, could not let go of strategy and conquest, but his body was betraying him. The fever climbed higher. By evening, he could no longer stand without assistance. As the days progressed, the entries in the royal diary became increasingly stark and repetitive, reflecting the monotonous horror of watching someone die slowly. Day after day, the routine remained the same. Alexander would be bathed, he would sacrifice to the gods, he would try to conduct business, and the fever would rage on. By the 4th day, he could no longer leave his bed. By the 5th, He had stopped speaking except in whispers. By the 6th, he could barely move. And still, impossibly, he clung to life. The physical toll on Alexander's body during these final days would have been catastrophic. A sustained high fever causes severe dehydration, no matter how much fluid is consumed. The body's metabolic rate increases dramatically, burning through energy reserves at an alarming pace. Muscles begin to waste away as the body cannibalizes its own tissue for fuel. The brain, deprived of proper hydration and subjected to elevated temperatures, functions increasingly poorly, leading to the delirium and confusion that Alexander experienced. His skin would have become papery thin, stretched tight over bones that seemed to grow more prominent by the hour. As Alexander weakened, his physicians tried increasingly desperate measures. They applied cold compresses to try to bring down his temperature. They forced fluids into him, though his swollen throat made swallowing difficult and painful. They administered various drugs and potions, opium for pain, willow bark for fever, countless herbal remedies that promised relief but delivered none. Some sources suggest they even resorted to magical incantations and rituals, calling upon gods and spirits when medicine failed. Nothing helped. The king was dying, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. By the 9th day, Alexander could no longer recognize most of his visitors. His eyes, once sharp and penetrating, described by contemporaries as having an almost leonine quality, had become glassy and unfocused. When his generals filed past his bed to pay their respects, he could barely acknowledge them. According to Arrian's account, Alexander managed to raise his head slightly and make a small gesture with his hand to each man, but he could not speak. It was a heartbreaking scene. The greatest military commanders of the age, men who had conquered half the world, reduced to helpless spectators as their leader slipped away. On the 10th day, June 10th, 323 BCE, Alexander's breathing became irregular. The death rattle, that distinctive, wet, rasping sound caused by fluid accumulation in the airways, filled the chamber. His physicians knew this sound well. It was the herald of death, the final stage before the end. Alexander's body, already devastated by days of high fever, was shutting down. His kidneys had likely failed, his liver was compromised, his heart was struggling to pump blood through increasingly sluggish vessels. The end was near. As evening approached on that 10th day, Alexander the Great drew his last breath. There was no dramatic final speech, no poignant last words of wisdom to pass down through the ages. Various historians would later invent such moments. When asked who should inherit his empire, he supposedly replied, "To the strongest," though this is almost certainly apocryphal. The truth was far less theatrical and far more human. Alexander simply stopped breathing, his ravaged body finally giving up its struggle. The king, who had never known defeat, had been defeated by something too small to see, too insidious to fight. And with his death, the ancient world would never be the same. The 6 days of preservation, a medical mystery. What happened next is one of the most bizarre and debated aspects of Alexander's death. According to multiple ancient sources, including Plutarch and the Royal Diary, something extraordinary occurred in the hours and days following the king's death. His body showed no signs of decomposition whatsoever. For 6 full days, in the sweltering heat of a Babylonian summer, Alexander's corpse remained as it had been at the moment of death, unchanged, unrotted, seemingly untouched by the normal processes of decay. This phenomenon was so unusual, so contrary to everything known about death in the ancient world, that many who saw it believed Alexander was not truly dead, but merely in some form of suspended animation. To understand how remarkable this was, we must consider what normally happens to a human body after death, especially in hot climates. Under normal circumstances, decomposition begins almost immediately after the heart stops beating. Within minutes, the body's cells, deprived of oxygen, begin to die. Within hours, bacteria that normally live in the gut begin to spread throughout the body, feeding on dead tissue and producing gases that cause bloating and discoloration. In hot weather, and June in Babylon is brutally hot, With temperatures often exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit, this process accelerates dramatically. A body left in such conditions would typically show visible signs of decay within 4 to 6 hours. Yet Alexander's body apparently defied these natural laws. According to the sources, when the embalmers finally came to prepare his body, a full 6 days after his death, they found it virtually unchanged. There was no bloating, no discoloration, no foul odor. His skin retained its color and elasticity. His limbs remained supple rather than rigid, with rigor mortis. To those who had witnessed countless deaths in battle and knew intimately what death looked like and smelled like, this was beyond extraordinary. It was miraculous, and it sparked wild speculation that has continued to our own time. The ancient sources offer a supernatural explanation for this preservation. Many believed it was a sign of Alexander's divinity, proof that he was not merely human, but a god or the son of a god. There were already cults dedicated to Alexander's worship during his lifetime. He had encouraged and even demanded recognition of his divine status, and this seeming miracle after death seemed to confirm those claims. The fact that his body remained incorrupt was seen as evidence that divinity does not decay like mortal flesh. It was propaganda that both his supporters and his would-be successors were eager to exploit. Modern medical historians have proposed more prosaic explanations for this phenomenon. One controversial theory, put forth by Dr. Catherine Hall of New Zealand's University of Otago, suggests that Alexander may not have actually been dead during those 6 days. Hall argues that Alexander might have suffered from Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare neurological condition that can cause progressive paralysis, including paralysis of the respiratory muscles. In severe cases, this can lead to a death-like state where breathing becomes so shallow as to be imperceptible and the body appears completely unresponsive. If this was the case, Alexander may have been buried alive, a horrifying prospect that would explain why his body showed no signs of decay during those first 6 days. However, most scholars reject this theory as implausible. The ancient physicians were highly skilled and would have tested for signs of life before declaring Alexander dead. Moreover, Guillain-Barré syndrome doesn't fit well with the other symptoms Alexander displayed, particularly the high fever. A more likely explanation lies in the specific pathology of whatever killed Alexander. If, as many now believe, he died from West Nile virus or a similar infection, his body may have been so severely dehydrated and depleted by the time of death that the normal bacterial processes of decomposition were significantly delayed. Essentially, there was less fluid in the tissues for bacteria to thrive in. Another factor may have been the immediate treatment of the body after death. While the sources emphasize that embalmers did not attend to Alexander until 6 days after his death, it's possible that the body was kept in a cool location or treated with preservative substances in the immediate aftermath of death. The royal palace would have had ice houses or underground chambers that remained relatively cool, even in summer. If Alexander's body was moved to such a location quickly, decomposition would have been significantly slowed. Combined with severe dehydration, this could account for the reported lack of decay during those first 6 days. There's also the question of political motivation in reporting this miracle. The sources we rely on were written decades or even centuries after the events, and they drew on accounts that may have been embellished or outright fabricated by those with a vested interest in promoting Alexander's divine status. The successor generals who fought over Alexander's empire all claimed legitimacy through their connection to him. What better way to bolster those claims than to emphasize that their former commander was no ordinary man, but a divine being whose body itself was miraculous? The truth of what actually happened during those 6 days may be forever obscured by layers of ancient propaganda. Regardless of the explanation, the reported preservation of Alexander's body had immediate practical consequences. The delay in beginning proper embalming procedures would prove catastrophic. In the hot, humid climate of Mesopotamia, even a partially preserved body is on borrowed time. The bacteria are merely dormant, waiting for the right conditions to begin their work. And when they finally did begin that work on Alexander's corpse, the results would be nothing short of horrifying. The miracle of preservation would give way to a nightmare of putrefaction that would shock even those hardened to the sight and smell of death. The beginning of decay, when nature reclaimed its due. On the 6th day after Alexander's death, the embalmers finally arrived to prepare the royal corpse for its journey to Egypt, where Alexander had planned to be buried in the temple of Zeus Ammon at Siwa Oasis. These were skilled practitioners, trained in the Egyptian arts of mummification and preservation. They had handled countless bodies, from common soldiers to high-ranking officials. They knew their craft intimately, knew what to expect when approaching a corpse that had been dead for nearly a week in summer heat, but nothing could have prepared them for what they found, or more accurately, for what happened shortly after they began their work. At first, the embalmers must have been astonished to find Alexander's body in such remarkable condition. The sources tell us that there was still no visible decay, no obvious signs that this had once been a living, breathing human being, now 6 days dead. The skin had not yet begun to slip or discolor. The features were still recognizable as those of the king. It must have seemed like a miracle, confirmation of all the rumors about divine preservation that had been circulating through the palace. But their wonder would be short-lived. The moment the embalmers began their work, making the first incisions to drain fluids and remove organs, something changed. It was as if their intervention broke some delicate equilibrium that had been maintaining the body's integrity. Or perhaps it was simply that the 6-day delay had brought the internal decomposition to a critical threshold, and any disturbance would trigger a cascade. Whatever the reason, decay began suddenly and dramatically, and when it came with a vengeance that would haunt those who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. The first sign would have been the smell. Anyone who has encountered the odor of decomposition knows it is like nothing else in human experience. A thick, cloying, sickeningly sweet stench that seems to coat the inside of your nostrils and throat, that clings to your clothes and hair, that you can almost taste on your tongue. It's the smell of proteins breaking down, of bacteria feeding on dead tissue, of gases produced by putrefaction. For those in the embalming chamber, the smell would have been overwhelming, made worse by the confined space and the heat. Some must have fled, unable to tolerate the sudden assault on their senses. Then came the visual changes. The skin, which had remained intact for 6 days, began to discolor. A greenish tint appeared, spreading across the abdomen first, always the first area to show putrefaction because of the high concentration of bacteria in the intestines. This marbling effect, caused by the hemoglobin in the blood breaking down and reacting with sulfur produced by bacteria, crept across Alexander's torso like some grotesque map. Dark veins became visible beneath the skin, creating a network of purple and green lines that made the body look less human and more like something from a nightmare. The bloating came next. As bacteria in the gut multiplied unchecked, they produced enormous quantities of gas, primarily methane and hydrogen sulfide. With nowhere to escape, these gases built up inside the body cavity, causing the abdomen to swell grotesquely. Alexander's once flat stomach, the product of years of military training and physical conditioning, distended into a horrible balloon-like protrusion. The pressure became so great that it forced fluids out of any available opening: the nose, the mouth, the ears. A purge of decomposition fluid, dark and foul-smelling, began to leak from the body. The embalmers, professional as they were, must have been horrified. This was not normal decomposition, or rather, it was 6 days of decomposition happening all at once, compressed into hours by whatever mechanism had delayed it initially. They worked frantically to arrest the decay, to salvage what they could of Alexander's body. They made their incisions, trying to drain the built-up gases and fluids. They attempted to remove the organs according to traditional Egyptian practice, but they were fighting a losing battle. The body was falling apart under their hands, literally coming undone as the cellular structure that had held it together disintegrated. The worst was perhaps the facial changes. Alexander had been known for his beauty. Numerous contemporary accounts describe his handsome features, his fair complexion, his leonine hair and eyes. Now that beauty was transforming into something hideous. The skin of the face, being relatively thin and close to the bone, began to take on a waxy, artificial appearance. The eyes, if they had not already been closed and covered, would have sunken into the skull as the orbs dehydrated. The lips pulled back from the teeth in a ghastly rictus grin, making Alexander look as if he were leering at death itself. It was a cruel mockery of the charismatic young king who had inspired such devotion in life. As hours turned into days, the decomposition accelerated further. The skin began to slip away from the underlying tissue, coming off in sheets if touched. This is a natural part of putrefaction, caused by the breakdown of the proteins that bind the epidermis to the dermis, but it's particularly disturbing to witness. The embalmers, trying to wash and prepare the body, would have found themselves inadvertently pulling away strips of Alexander's skin, revealing the wet, reddish tissue beneath. Every attempt to handle the corpse with dignity only seemed to hasten its disintegration. The embalmer's nightmare. Preserving the unpreservable. The embalmers faced an impossible task. They had been called in too late, and the body was deteriorating too rapidly for traditional preservation methods to be effective, but they had no choice. This was not just any corpse. This was Alexander the Great, king of Macedonia, pharaoh of Egypt, master of the known world. His body needed to be preserved, not just for burial, but for display, for political legitimacy, for the various successor generals who would claim authority through their connection to him. Failure was not an option, and so, despite the horrifying state of the corpse, they persevered with their gruesome work. The first step in Egyptian embalming was removal of the internal organs. Traditionally, this was done through a small incision in the left side of the abdomen, through which the embalmers would reach in with specialized tools to extract the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines. The brain was removed through the nose using long hooks. Only the heart was left in place, as it was considered the seat of intelligence and emotion in Egyptian belief. But with Alexander's body already in an advanced state of decay, this process would have been exponentially more difficult and disgusting than usual. When the embalmers made their incision into Alexander's abdomen, they would have been met with a rush of foul-smelling gases and fluids. The internal organs, which should have been relatively intact, were already beginning to liquefy. The intestines, filled with bacteria even in life, would have been in the worst condition, bloated, discolored, and nearly dissolving into a putrid soup. Extracting them without having them fall apart would have required extreme care and a strong stomach. The smell in the embalming chamber must have been unbearable, a concentrated essence of death and decay. The brain removal would have been equally nightmarish. The traditional method involved inserting a long hook up through the nostril, piercing the thin bone at the base of the skull, and then using the hook to break up the brain matter into small enough pieces to be extracted. Under normal circumstances, this was a delicate but manageable procedure. But if Alexander's brain had begun to liquefy, and after 6 days in the heat, it almost certainly had, the embalmers would have found themselves dealing with a semi-liquid mass rather than solid tissue. Some of it could be hooked out, but much would simply drain out of the nose and ears as the skull was manipulated, a horrifying sight even for professionals accustomed to death. Once the organs were removed, the next step was to dehydrate and preserve the body using natron, a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate. The body would be packed inside and out with this substance, which would draw out moisture and inhibit further bacterial growth. But natron works slowly, requiring weeks or even months to fully dehydrate a body. Time was a luxury the embalmers didn't have. They needed to slow the decay immediately, and that meant using more aggressive methods that were not part of the traditional Egyptian practice. Some sources suggest the embalmers resorted to immersing Alexander's body in honey. This might sound bizarre, but it was actually a legitimate preservation technique in the ancient world. Honey is hygroscopic, meaning it draws moisture out of anything submerged in it, and it also has natural antibacterial properties. A body preserved in honey could remain relatively intact for extended periods. According to some accounts, Alexander's corpse was placed in a golden sarcophagus filled with honey for transport. Whether this actually happened is debatable, but it represents the kind of desperate measures the embalmers might have taken when traditional methods proved insufficient. They would have also used various aromatic substances, frankincense, myrrh, cinnamon, and other expensive spices, not just for religious purposes, but to mask the overwhelming stench of decay. These substances were packed into the body cavity where the organs had been, and the incision was sewn shut or covered with a plate. The entire body was then wrapped in linen bandages that had been soaked in resin, creating a sealed shell that would protect the body from further environmental damage. But underneath those bandages, despite all their efforts, Alexander's body continued its inexorable transformation from living flesh to dead matter. The face required special attention. Even after embalming, the facial features continued to collapse as the tissue underneath lost its structural integrity. To combat this, embalmers would have packed the cheeks and throat with linen or sawdust, trying to restore some semblance of Alexander's living appearance. They would have applied cosmetics, rouge to the cheeks, paint to the lips, to cover the discoloration and give the corpse a more lifelike appearance. It was a grotesque form of theater, an attempt to maintain the fiction that this decomposing husk was still somehow the glorious young conqueror who had changed the world. Despite all these efforts, everyone involved knew the truth. They were fighting a losing battle. You cannot reverse decomposition once it has truly begun. You can only slow it, mask it, try to preserve what remains for as long as possible. The embalmers had succeeded in creating something that could be transported and displayed, something that bore a superficial resemblance to Alexander the Great. But underneath the wrappings and preservatives and cosmetics, the body continued its inevitable decay. The tissues continued to break down, the bacteria continued their feast, and the man who had conquered half the world continued his transformation into dust. The political corpse, fighting over dead flesh. While the embalmers struggled with the physical reality of Alexander's decaying body, his generals were engaged in an equally gruesome struggle over the political implications of that body. In the ancient world, control of a ruler's corpse was immensely important. It conferred legitimacy on those who possessed it, suggesting divine favor and rightful succession. Alexander's body was therefore not just a dead king. It was a political tool, a symbol of power, and a prize worth fighting over. The result was a macabre conflict that would see Alexander's corpse become a pawn in the wars that tore his empire apart. Alexander had expressed a wish to be buried at the temple of Zeus Ammon at Siwa Oasis in Egypt, where an oracle had supposedly confirmed his divine parentage. Accordingly, preparations began to transport his body to Egypt. A magnificent funeral carriage was constructed. According to the historian Diodorus Siculus, it was an elaborate vehicle covered in gold, with columns, a vaulted roof, and intricate decorations depicting Alexander's military victories. Inside, Alexander's body rested in a golden anthropoid sarcophagus, supposedly filled with honey or sweet-smelling spices. The funeral procession would be a statement of Alexander's greatness, visible proof of his godlike status, even in death. But the journey to Egypt would never be completed as originally planned. Perdiccas, who had effectively seized control of the empire as regent for Alexander's mentally disabled half-brother and unborn son, intended to escort the body to Macedonia first. where he could use it to legitimize his own claim to power. However, Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most capable generals and the newly appointed satrap of Egypt, had other plans. Ptolemy understood the propaganda value of possessing Alexander's remains. If he could get the body to Egypt and establish a cult around it, he could use Alexander's posthumous divine status to legitimize his own rule over Egypt. In 321 BCE, approximately 2 years after Alexander's death, the funeral procession finally left Babylon. Perdiccas's general Aridaeus was in charge of the cortege, which proceeded slowly westward with great ceremony. But as it approached the border of Syria, Ptolemy made his move. He met the procession with an army and essentially hijacked Alexander's corpse, seizing it by force and rushing it to Egypt. This was an act of supreme audacity, effectively a theft of the king's body. But Ptolemy calculated correctly that the other successor generals would be too busy fighting each other to mount an effective response. Ptolemy first took the body to Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt, where it was interred temporarily while a more permanent tomb was prepared. Later, probably during the reign of Ptolemy II, the body was moved to Alexandria, the great city Alexander had founded on Egypt's Mediterranean coast. There, it was placed in a magnificent tomb in the center of the city, becoming the centerpiece of a cult dedicated to Alexander's worship. The Ptolemaic dynasty would use Alexander's body as the foundation of their claim to rule Egypt, presenting themselves as the legitimate heirs to Alexander's empire through their possession of his remains. But what exactly was in that tomb? By this point, several years after death, Alexander's body would have been completely desiccated by the embalming process. Inside the wrappings, it would have been little more than a leathery husk, skin stretched tight over bones, all moisture long since extracted by natron and time. The features would have been unrecognizable without the cosmetic reconstruction done by the embalmers. It was a relic, certainly, but one whose connection to the living, breathing Alexander was increasingly tenuous. Yet to those who came to worship, it was sacred, a physical manifestation of divine power that could be seen and venerated. The tomb in Alexandria became one of the ancient world's great tourist attractions. Important visitors to Egypt would pay their respects to Alexander, and several Roman emperors made pilgrimages to see the body. Julius Caesar visited and was reportedly moved to tears. Augustus Caesar came and accidentally broke off Alexander's nose while attempting to place a golden crown on the mummy's head. A darkly comic moment in the continuing indignities suffered by Alexander's corpse. Caligula supposedly stole Alexander's breastplate from the tomb to wear himself, claiming a connection to the ancient conqueror. Each visitor, each handling, each political appropriation further degraded whatever remained of Alexander's physical form. Over the centuries, the tomb was moved several times within Alexandria, and the body's condition continued to deteriorate. By the time of the later Roman Empire, it's unclear whether anything substantial remained beyond fragments of bone and desiccated tissue. The last definite mention of someone viewing Alexander's body dates to around 215 CE, when the Emperor Caracalla visited the tomb. After that, the historical record goes silent. The tomb's location was lost, buried beneath the accumulated layers of later construction as Alexandria rebuilt itself over centuries. Today, despite numerous archaeological expeditions, Alexander's final resting place remains undiscovered. The fate of Alexander's body mirrors the fate of his empire: fragmented, fought over, ultimately lost. What began as a carefully preserved corpse, meant to establish legitimacy and inspire devotion, ended as an archaeological mystery. The flesh that once housed one of history's greatest minds, the body that led armies across continents, the physical form that survived countless battles, all reduced to dust and scattered across time. It's a sobering reminder of mortality's ultimate victory. No matter how great the individual, no matter how careful the preservation, the body eventually succumbs. All that remains are stories, legends, and the questions that still haunt historians. What really killed Alexander? Where is his body now? And what would we find if we ever discovered his tomb? Medical theories. What killed Alexander? For over 2,000 years, scholars have debated the question, what actually killed Alexander the Great? The ancient sources offer various theories, from divine punishment to poison to simple disease, but they lack the medical knowledge to provide definitive answers. Modern researchers, armed with our understanding of infectious diseases, toxicology, and pathology, have re-examined the ancient accounts and proposed numerous theories. Each has its advocates, each fits some, but not all of the evidence, and none can be proven with absolute certainty. What follows is an exploration of the most credible medical theories for Alexander's death, and what each would have meant for the horrifying decay of his body. The poison theory is perhaps the oldest and most dramatic explanation. Whispered in Babylon, even as Alexander lay dying, it gained traction because of the political chaos that followed his death. Who would have wanted Alexander dead? Take your pick. Generals who resented his adoption of Persian customs, Macedonian nobles who felt marginalized, or even Aristotle, Alexander's former tutor, whose nephew had been executed on Alexander's orders. The most popular version of the poison theory fingers Antipater, the regent Alexander had left in charge of Macedonia, who supposedly sent his sons to Babylon with a poison obtained from Aristotle to be administered at the fateful banquet. The poison supposedly used was extracted from the water of the river Styx, which flowed through a gorge in Arcadia. Ancient sources claim this water was so toxic it could dissolve any container except one made from a horse's hoof. Modern scholars initially dismissed this as pure mythology, but some have suggested it might refer to water contaminated with toxic bacteria or a plant-based poison, like hellebore. However, most medical historians now reject the poison theory entirely. The prolonged nature of Alexander's illness, 10 days of fever, not the rapid death typically associated with poisoning, doesn't fit well with any known toxin. Moreover, the described symptoms match infectious disease far better than poisoning. Malaria has long been a leading candidate for what killed Alexander. The disease was endemic to the marshy regions around Babylon, and Alexander's symptoms, fever, chills, sweating, are consistent with severe malaria. The Plasmodium falciparum parasite, which causes the deadliest form of malaria, can lead to cerebral malaria, explaining the delirium and confusion Alexander experienced. The disease can also cause a prolonged fever that matches the timeline of Alexander's illness. However, malaria typically presents with cyclical fevers, periods of intense symptoms followed by periods of relative normalcy, and the ancient accounts describe a fever that was constant and unremitting. This doesn't entirely rule out malaria, but it suggests it might not be the complete answer. Typhoid fever is another strong possibility. Caused by the bacterium Salmonella typhi and spread through contaminated food and water, typhoid produces a sustained fever that can last for weeks if untreated. The disease also causes severe dehydration, abdominal pain, and in advanced cases, delirium and mental confusion. All of these symptoms match what Alexander experienced. Typhoid fever was certainly present in the ancient world. Poor sanitation and crowded urban conditions made it common in cities like Babylon. The disease's mortality rate, even today, can be as high as 10 to 30% without treatment. In the ancient world, without antibiotics or even basic understanding of bacterial infection, survival rates would have been much lower. A more recent theory, proposed by Dr. John Marr and Dr. Charles Kalischer, suggests that Alexander died from West Nile virus. This mosquito-borne illness, endemic to the Middle East and Mediterranean, can cause severe neurological symptoms, including fever, weakness, paralysis, and coma. In its most severe form, West Nile virus has a mortality rate of about 10% and can cause death within days or weeks of infection. The theory is particularly intriguing because it could explain both Alexander's symptoms and the reported 6-day delay in decomposition. If the virus caused extensive dehydration and fever, Alexander's body might have been so desiccated at the time of death that bacterial decomposition was significantly delayed. Some researchers have suggested that Alexander might have died from a perforated bowel or intestinal disease. He had been wounded in the abdomen during his Indian campaigns, and it's possible that old injury had never properly healed, leading to chronic complications. A perforated intestine would leak bacteria into the abdominal cavity, causing peritonitis, an infection of the abdominal lining that produces fever, severe pain, and, if untreated, death. The timeline fits, as peritonitis can kill over a period of days to weeks. However, the ancient sources don't specifically mention the abdominal pain that would be the hallmark of peritonitis, making this theory less compelling than the infectious disease theories. Then there's the theory proposed by Dr. Catherine Hall that we mentioned earlier, that Alexander suffered from Guillain-Barré syndrome and was actually still alive when declared dead. This neurological disorder causes progressive paralysis and can be triggered by certain infections. Hall argues that if Alexander contracted Campylobacter pylori from contaminated food or water, it could have triggered Guillain-Barré syndrome. The resulting paralysis, including paralysis of the respiratory muscles, could have created a death-like state that fooled ancient physicians. However, as noted previously, most scholars find this theory unconvincing because it doesn't adequately explain the fever and delirium that characterized Alexander's illness. It's also possible, perhaps even likely, that Alexander didn't die from a single cause, but from a combination of factors. His body had been subjected to extraordinary stresses over more than a decade of continuous campaigning. He had survived numerous serious wounds, including an arrow through the lung. He drank heavily, which would have compromised his liver function. He had marched his armies through deserts, over mountains, and into regions where exotic diseases flourished. By the time he reached Babylon, Alexander's immune system may have been so weakened that an illness that might have been survivable for someone else proved fatal for him. The final fever might have been the last straw that broke an already overburdened body. Regardless of the specific cause, one fact is clear. Alexander died from an illness that caused severe fever and dehydration, probably an infectious disease of some kind. And that disease, whatever it was, set the stage for the horrifying decomposition that followed. The dehydration would have affected the speed and nature of the decay. The fever would have effectively cooked the body from the inside, denaturing proteins and beginning the breakdown process even before death occurred. When Alexander's heart finally stopped, his body was already primed for rapid, catastrophic decomposition. The miracle isn't that it eventually rotted, it's that it held together as long as it did. The science of decomposition, understanding the process. To truly understand the horror of what happened to Alexander's body, we need to understand the scientific process of human decomposition. It's a subject most people prefer not to think about, but it's an inevitable part of the human condition. Every living thing must eventually return to the elements from which it came, and that transformation follows predictable biological and chemical pathways. What happened to Alexander was an accelerated version of what happens to every human corpse, compressed into days because of the delay in treatment and the harsh environmental conditions. By understanding the science, we can better appreciate the nightmarish reality of Alexander's decay. Decomposition begins at the moment of death. When the heart stops beating, cells throughout the body are immediately deprived of oxygen. Without oxygen, cells cannot produce energy through normal metabolic processes. They switch to anaerobic metabolism, which produces lactic acid as a waste product. This lactic acid begins to break down cell walls and membranes. Within minutes, the body's cells start to die en masse. This process, called autolysis or self-digestion, is the body essentially eating itself from the inside out as cellular enzymes, no longer controlled by living processes, begin breaking down the cell's own structures. The second phase of decomposition involves bacteria. The human body is host to trillions of bacteria, most of them living peacefully in the intestines where they help digest food. While we're alive, our immune system keeps these bacteria confined to appropriate areas. But when we die, the immune system shuts down and the bacteria are free to spread. They migrate out of the intestines and begin colonizing other parts of the body, feeding on the dead tissue. As they multiply and consume, they produce gases, methane, hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, and others. These gases are what cause the bloating characteristic of decomposition, and they're responsible for much of the horrific smell. The third phase involves insects. In nature, flies arrive within minutes of death, attracted by the odors of decomposition. They lay eggs in any available opening, eyes, nose, mouth, wounds, and these eggs hatch into larvae, maggots, within hours. The maggots are extraordinarily efficient at consuming dead tissue, and in warm conditions, they can reduce a human body to bones in a matter of weeks. However, if the body is protected from insects, as Alexander's would have been inside the palace, this phase is delayed or eliminated. This actually slows the overall rate of decomposition, which is why ancient embalmers took care to wrap bodies and seal them away from flies. Temperature is perhaps the most critical factor affecting the rate of decomposition. Heat accelerates all chemical and biological reactions. For every 10 degrees Celsius increase in temperature, the rate of decomposition roughly doubles. This is why bodies decompose so rapidly in tropical climates and can remain remarkably preserved in cold conditions. In June in Babylon, with temperatures regularly exceeding 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, Alexander's body would have been in the worst possible environment for preservation. The heat would have accelerated both autolysis and bacterial activity, causing decomposition to proceed at maximum speed once it began. Moisture is the second critical factor. Bacteria need water to thrive and reproduce. A completely desiccated body will decompose very slowly because bacteria cannot function without moisture. This is the principle behind mummification. Remove the water from the body, and you remove the medium in which bacteria live. This may be the key to understanding the 6-day delay in Alexander's decomposition. If his fever and dehydration were severe enough, his body at the time of death may have contained much less water than normal. Without adequate moisture, the bacteria that would normally drive decomposition were dormant. But as soon as the embalmers began working on the body, introducing moisture through washing and handling, the bacteria awakened with a vengeance. The visible stages of decomposition follow a predictable pattern. First comes pallor mortis, the paleness that occurs as blood settles due to gravity. This happens within minutes of death. Next is algor mortis, the cooling of the body to ambient temperature, which occurs over several hours. Rigor mortis, the stiffening of muscles caused by chemical changes in muscle tissue, typically begins 2 to 6 hours after death, peaks at 12 hours, and then dissipates over the next 24 to 48 hours. Alexander's body, if it truly showed no signs of decay for 6 days, should have passed through all these stages. The fact that it reportedly remained supple suggests either the ancient accounts were exaggerated or that something highly unusual was occurring. After the initial stages comes putrefaction, true decomposition. This begins with a greenish discoloration of the abdominal wall, usually appearing 24-48 hours after death. The discoloration spreads as bacteria multiply and produce sulfur compounds that react with hemoglobin in the blood. Dark veins become visible across the skin in a marbling pattern. The skin takes on a leathery appearance and may slip off in sheets. The abdomen bloats with gas, often dramatically, and pressure builds until gases are forced out of body openings along with fluids. The smell becomes overwhelming. This is the stage that Alexander's embalmers would have encountered once decomposition finally began. 6 days of putrefaction happening all at once. In advanced decomposition, the body enters a stage called liquefaction, where tissues break down into liquid. The organs disintegrate, muscles separate from bones, and the body essentially melts into a soup of decomposed organic matter. This is the most horrifying stage of decomposition, when the human form becomes completely unrecognizable. Eventually, only bones remain, and even these will eventually decay over decades or centuries as minerals leach out and the collagen that gives bone its flexibility breaks down. The journey from living human to scattered elements is inevitable and irreversible. Alexander's body followed this path, just like every other corpse in history, though the circumstances made his journey particularly dramatic and disturbing. Legacy of decay. How death shaped Alexander's mythology. The horrifying circumstances of Alexander's death and the subsequent decay of his body had profound effects on how he was remembered by history. In life, Alexander had carefully cultivated an image of invincibility, the undefeated general, the son of Zeus, the man who could accomplish anything through will and courage alone. But death stripped away that myth with brutal efficiency. The image of Alexander's body rotting in the heat of Babylon, the smell of decomposition filling the palace chambers, the desperate attempts of embalmers to preserve what was already lost. These details created a counter-narrative to the legend of Alexander the Invincible. They reminded people that for all his achievements, Alexander was fundamentally human, subject to the same biological imperatives as any other mortal. Yet paradoxically, the strange preservation of Alexander's body during the first 6 days after death also enhanced his mythological status. The fact that his corpse reportedly showed no signs of decay was interpreted by many as proof of his divine nature. If he had been merely human, surely his body would have immediately begun to rot like any other corpse. The delay in decomposition seemed to confirm that Alexander was different, special, touched by the gods. This belief was politically useful to those who claimed to be Alexander's successors, and they actively promoted stories about the miraculous condition of his corpse. The contradiction, Alexander's body both proving his mortality through its eventual decay and his divinity through its initial preservation, created a complex legacy that has fascinated people ever since. The treatment of Alexander's body after death also set important precedents for how powerful rulers would be handled in death. The elaborate embalming, the magnificent funeral procession, the competition among successors to control the body, the establishment of a cult around the corpse, all of these became templates for future generations. When Julius Caesar was assassinated, his body was displayed publicly, and his supporters used the spectacle to whip up political support. When Augustus died, his body was carefully preserved and paraded through Rome before cremation. The idea that a ruler's corpse was not just a body, but a political and religious symbol, can be traced directly back to the precedent set by Alexander's death. The mystery surrounding Alexander's tomb has only added to his legend. The fact that we don't know where his body ultimately ended up has spawned countless theories and archaeological expeditions. Some believe the tomb still lies undiscovered beneath the streets of Alexandria, waiting to be found. Others think the body was moved multiple times and may have ended up in places as diverse as Venice, where the body in the Basilica of St. Mark might actually be Alexander's, not St. Mark's, or Siwa Oasis in Egypt. The uncertainty means that Alexander's final resting place remains one of archaeology's great unsolved mysteries, a fitting ending for a man whose life was itself the stuff of legend. The stories about Alexander's death have been retold and reinterpreted countless times over the centuries. Medieval writers transformed him into a Christian moral exemplar, using his death as a lesson about the vanity of earthly glory. Renaissance authors were fascinated by the medical aspects of his demise, using it to speculate about poison and disease. Modern historians have brought scientific methods to bear on the question, analyzing the ancient sources with tools ranging from epidemiology to toxicology. Each generation has found something different in Alexander's death, using it to address contemporary concerns and anxieties about mortality, power, and legacy. Perhaps most significantly, Alexander's death at the age of 32, while tragic, has actually enhanced his reputation. Had he lived another 30 years, he would have had to deal with the mundane challenges of governance rather than the glory of conquest. He would have grown old, possibly become bloated and corrupt like so many rulers before and after him. His empire would have faced revolts and economic challenges. His legend would have been tarnished by the inevitable compromises and failures of long-term rule. Instead, he died at the height of his power, his legend frozen at the moment of greatest achievement. The decay of his body stands in stark contrast to the immortality of his reputation. The fascination with Alexander's corpse also reflects a broader human preoccupation with the bodies of the famous dead. From Lenin's preserved body in Moscow to Eva Perón's corpse stolen and hidden by the Argentine military, from Napoleon's remains fought over by France and Britain, to Elvis Presley's grave becoming a pilgrimage site, there's something about the physical remains of the famous that captures the imagination. We want to see and touch what remains of greatness, as if proximity to the corpse can somehow connect us to the achievements of the living person. Alexander's body, though lost to history, started this tradition. It was the first time a ruler's corpse became not just a relic, but a commodity, fought over and displayed for political and emotional purposes. In the end, the story of Alexander's rotting death serves as a powerful memento mori, a reminder of death for anyone who believes that achievement or power can somehow transcend mortality. The man who conquered the known world, who was worshipped as a god, who seemed invincible in battle, died of something as mundane as fever. His body, preserved with such care and expense, still rotted away like any other corpse. The elaborate tomb that was built to house him has been lost. Even his bones, if they still exist somewhere, have long since been separated from any meaningful connection to the person he was. All that survives intact is the story, and the lesson that death is the ultimate equalizer, respecting neither achievement nor reputation nor power. In that sense, Alexander's death may be his most important legacy, reminding us that we are all, in the end, nothing more than temporary arrangements of matter, doomed to return to the dust from which we came. Conclusion: the ultimate conquest. In the sweltering heat of that Babylonian June, as Alexander the Great's body finally succumbed to the inevitable forces of decay, those who witnessed it learned a lesson that every generation must learn anew, that death conquers all. The man who had never been defeated in battle, who had led his armies across continents and established an empire that stretched from Greece to India, was defeated by something too small to see, too primitive to fight. The body that had survived countless wounds and hardships could not survive a microscopic invader, whether virus or bacterium, and in death, that body became subject to the same biological processes as any peasant or slave. The story we've explored is not a pleasant one. We've seen Alexander reduced from a living, breathing conqueror to a fever-racked invalid, from there to a corpse, from corpse to a decaying mass of tissue, and finally to a political symbol fought over by ambitious men. We've examined the medical realities of his death, the horrifying details of decomposition, the desperate efforts to preserve what could not be preserved. These are not the stories we usually tell about Alexander the Great. We prefer to focus on his victories, his brilliance, his ambition. But the story of his death is just as much a part of his legacy as any battle he won. What makes Alexander's death particularly poignant is the contrast between his life and his end. Here was a man who seemed larger than life, whose achievements were so extraordinary that people believed he must be a god. Yet he died like any other man, sick, suffering, reduced to helplessness. The 6-day preservation of his body, whether miraculous or merely a result of dehydration, only delayed the inevitable. When decay came, it came with a vengeance, transforming the beautiful young king into something horrifying. No amount of embalming or political manipulation could restore what had been lost. Death had claimed its victory, and no human agency could reverse it. The medical theories we've discussed, malaria, typhoid, West Nile virus, or some combination of factors, all point to the same conclusion. Alexander died from an infectious disease that overwhelmed his weakened body. The decade of continuous campaigning, the wounds accumulated in battle, the stress of command, the heavy drinking, all of these had taken their toll. By the time he reached Babylon, Alexander was no longer the invincible young warrior who had set out from Macedonia. He was a man in his early 30s, with the body of someone much older, worn down by the demands he had placed upon it. When illness struck, he had no reserves left to fight it. The scientific understanding of decomposition helps us appreciate just how universal and inexorable this process is. Every human body, no matter how carefully preserved, eventually returns to its constituent elements. The proteins break down into amino acids, the amino acids into simpler compounds, until nothing organic remains. What happens to a corpse is not personal, not meaningful, not a reflection of the person who once inhabited that body. It's simply chemistry and biology following their predetermined courses. Alexander's body rotted not because he deserved such an end, not because the gods willed it, but because that's what happens to all dead tissue given time and the right conditions. Yet there is something meaningful in the story, nonetheless. The way Alexander's body was treated after death, the political fights over possession of the corpse, the elaborate preservation attempts, the establishment of a cult around his remains, all of this speaks to the very human need to deny death's finality. We preserve bodies, build monuments, create rituals around the dead, all in an attempt to hold on to what has been lost. Alexander's successors understood that controlling his body gave them a claim to his legacy, but what they were really trying to control was mortality itself. They failed, as all such attempts must fail. The body rotted, the tomb was lost, and all that remains are stories. The legacy of Alexander's horrifying death extends far beyond the ancient world. It reminds us that achievement and power provide no protection against the biological realities of existence. It demonstrates that the human need to memorialize and preserve the dead is as old as civilization itself. It shows us that the boundary between the sacred and the horrific is thinner than we might like to believe. Alexander's body was simultaneously a holy relic and a rotting corpse, and these identities coexisted without contradiction for those who worshipped at his tomb. Most importantly, it teaches us that confronting the reality of death, including its most disturbing aspects, is essential to understanding what it means to be human. As we conclude this exploration of Alexander's death, it's worth reflecting on why we tell stories like this. Why dwell on the gruesome details of decomposition? Why examine the medical horrors of a king's demise? Because these stories, uncomfortable as they are, connect us to our shared human experience. Death is the one thing we all have in common, the one certainty in an uncertain world. By confronting it directly, by looking unflinchingly at what happens to the body after death, we can perhaps come to terms with our own mortality. We can recognize that fame and achievement, while valuable, are ultimately temporary. What endures is not the body, but the impact we have on the world, the stories people tell about us, the changes we effect during our brief time alive. Alexander the Great changed the world in ways that still resonate today. He spread Greek culture across vast territories, creating a cosmopolitan civilization that blended Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and Indian influences. He founded cities that still exist, He inspired countless military leaders and conquerors who came after him. His campaigns opened up trade routes and cultural exchanges that shaped the development of the ancient world. These achievements are his true legacy, not the rotting corpse in a Babylonian palace, or even the preserved body in its Alexandrian tomb. The body was always going to decay. That was never in doubt. But the impact of his actions, the ripples he created in the stream of history, those have proven more durable than any embalming process. And so we leave Alexander where we found him, in Babylon, in the heat of June, dying of a fever he could not conquer. His body would rot, would be fought over, would eventually be lost to history, but his story survives, and in surviving, it continues to teach us about ambition, mortality, and the ultimate limits of human power. Death conquered Alexander the Great, just as it conquers everyone. But Alexander, through his deeds and the stories told about him, achieved a form of immortality that has nothing to do with the preservation of flesh. In the end, that may be the only victory over death that any of us can hope for. Not to avoid dying, which is impossible, but to live in such a way that we are remembered, that we matter, that some small piece of who we were continues after the body has returned to dust. That is the final lesson of Alexander's horrifying, rotting death. That true legacy is measured not in the condition of one's corpse, but in the mark one leaves on the world of the living.